How many times have you tuned into a crime channel just to hear DNA was the smoking gun evidence that put somebody away? Have you turned on the television and watched a trial or the end of a trial where DNA was the contributing factor that was able to identify or let somebody walk free? And how many stories have you heard about DNA absolving crimes that happened in the past? It seems that the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a lot of people that have spent time in jail for 20 or 30 years that ended up getting out because of DNA. So that being said, welcome to my channel, True Crime. I'm your host, Tim Solberg. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that like button down below. It helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Hit that subscribe and leave a comment if I've missed anything or you're an expert. I want to hear from you. So let me start off by saying I don't give legal advice and I'm no doctor by any means. I've taken the equivalent of high school biology and essentially biology 101 in college. That means I am not an expert in this field. This video, however, does bring or introduce the history and how DNA changed crime scene investigations forever. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with what is DNA. DNA, and this is the definition if you Google it, I'll put it up on the screen as well, a self-replicating material that is present in nearly all living organisms as the main constituent of chromosomes. It is the carrier of genetic information. Okay, so if you're like me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. All I know is when I hear the word or the three letters in a trial, that means that there's a good shot that they're either going to convict or somebody's going to be proven not guilty. Okay, so what is DNA in simple words? It's basically what is found in any living organism. So could be found in your saliva, could be found in your blood, in your hair, in your fingernails. Basically anything that requires a molecule that's living is going to be DNA. So for our purposes, what is DNA used for? So for crime scenes, it's any time that something is left behind that belongs to an individual. Okay. Once that's left behind as an individual, it's collected, it's sent to a lab, and then there's forensic testing that is completed on it. Okay. Before we move on, let's just talk about the history of DNA. So most people look at James Watson and Francis Crick as being the folks who essentially found DNA. I don't want to say invented because DNA has always been there, but they were the ones to discover DNA in Cambridge in 1953, so something coming out of London. However, a lot of people say that if you go way back to the 1860s, you're going to see that Friedrich Miescher was actually doing tests on white blood cells, and it is said that that's when he found or came up with DNA. Okay, so when did we first get to see it in our criminal justice? That is a very important question, and that's why we're here today. So everything else, like I said, I'm not an expert on DNA by any means. There's many people that could come on here, and I would love to hear from you folks to give more details on what DNA is, how DNA is found. For this video, again, we are just looking at it from a criminal justice standpoint. So in 1987, it was the first time that DNA was utilized in a trial to identify the criminal in a case, and that was Colin Pitchfork. Essentially, Colin Pitchfork was the first one to be convicted by DNA for the rape and murder of two females. In the US, during 1987, which was the same year, the first case that utilized DNA was against Tommy Lee Andrews, who was convicted of burglarizing and raping a woman in Florida. So those were the first cases that DNA was really utilized, depending on if you look at overseas in London or if you're looking at home in the US. So since 1987, a lot of cases do bring forward DNA. The ones that we hear about the most are typically the cases where DNA takes or puts doubt in a previous crime and gets somebody out of jail. We hear about those quite a bit. There's a new form of DNA that is essentially being utilized right now to help solve crimes, and we're seeing it specifically in the Kohberger crime right now, and we think we're going to see this type of testing in the Rachel Morin crime as well, and that is genealogy genetic DNA. What that means is when somebody goes to the store, say like a Best Buy or a Target or online on Amazon or whatever you prefer, you order something like 23andMe. Now in that kit, it's going to come with a swab, and you can use the swab and you send it in, and essentially that's going to tell you who your ancestors are and any background that they have on your DNA. Basically, you're going to find out, depending on how many of your family members have used this same product, you're going to be able to tell mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, second cousins, third cousins, so on and so forth, based off of who's utilizing the product. Now, the way that the police use it, if you see specifically in the Kohberger case, they were able to use the DNA that they found from Kohberger's father to be able to identify Brian Kohberger. So let me back up just a second. They just didn't magically find his dad's DNA. At some point, Brian Kohberger's dad had to have utilized some sort of ancestral DNA testing kit. And based off of that, the authorities were able to cross-reference the DNA samples that they had from the knife sheath in the rented home of Maddie Mogen, Casey Gonzalez, Xana Kernodle, and her boyfriend who was staying the night, Ethan Chapin. Based off the evidence, it would say the DNA would belong to the son of Brian Kohberger's dad, thus giving them a suspect that they could look into. Now, what's crazy is when we look at prior to DNA, criminal justice and forensics analysis would have to rely on things like shoe prints, fingerprints, footprints, things that were left at the scene, eyewitnesses, testimony, alibis, things like that. Whereas DNA could really highlight somebody if they left that DNA in the scene of the crime. They're able to pinpoint with over 99% accuracy of whose DNA that might be. Now you fast forward to 2018, and now we've got the genetic genealogy DNA that's being utilized today. So if people that are using 23andMe and other kits of the sort, their DNA is being stored, and the police are cross-referencing this to see if it matches with any relatives. And based off of that, they're able to triangulate and name suspects. Now, I will say that there's some controversy with this for sure. The courts are trying to decide how much of this is invading privacy currently. They're only using it for violent crimes as we see today. And is this something that could be overturned in the future based on whoever brings it up through the courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court? And if that does happen, anybody that is convicted based off of that evidence alone, are they going to be able to get an appeal, get a retrial, or even get their conviction overturned? And that's something that we really need to think through, because this could have an impact on us in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? And that's kind of a little bit of the history of DNA, how it works in forensics. Now, I know that there's a lot more details, and obviously, when you're going through, a forensic scientist could get very specific with you. Again, this video is just intended to educate you a little bit on DNA, how it's utilized in trial, and really to put it in a normal person's perspective like me. Again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not in the medical field. I've got very basic knowledge of biology. Again, biology 101 in college, essentially. But that's really high school if you think about it, because I only took one class there in college that was around biology. And I'm just a simple person that loves, digging into crime stories and getting different perspectives on how crime works. But DNA interests me. Again, I'm no expert. So if you're an expert, I would love to hear from you. What did I miss? What other ways or other things that you would like to get across for somebody like me on how to understand what DNA is and the impact that it's had on crime since 1987, right? Because for me, it is a lot. Just like fingerprints, just like shoe prints, and I think we're going to find a lot more stuff around DNA. So based off of that, I know the video was a little bit different. This is really a quick look on how DNA changed criminal justice and how criminal justice moves forward today, how forensics looks, and really how they can use this in trial. And the last thing I'm going to ask before we end this video is, if you were a juror how much impact would DNA have for you? If it's found or if it's not found, I want to hear from you. Again, if you made it this long, hit that subscribe button down below. Hit those comments. I want to hear from you. Hit a like. Let's continue to grow the channel. Our goal is to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. We're well on our way, but we've got a lot of work to do. On that note, I'm your host, Tim Sahlberg. I hope everybody has a wonderful week.